All right, everybody, good evening. Nice to see such a nice turnout. I haven't got a great deal to say. I know it's 2 months since we had a meeting, so I should be full of things to say, but all I can say is I'm feeling a bit like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer at the moment after having been walking down the beach at Caloundra this morning. But outside of that, I suppose we all saw the coverage of the Washington accident. Very nasty. Very nasty. Would appear to be, at this stage anyway, that the helicopter pilot had an aircraft in sight, but not the correct aircraft in sight. It's quite clear on the audio that he was asked, did he have the aircraft in sight? And he said he did, and that he requested to visual separation. And anyway, you can see on the video that his little spot just flies straight at this one. Pow. Anyway, that's it, really. Our guest tonight is Ray Vuillermin, who's had a long, long career in aviation. And tonight he's going to talk about pilot training since 1914. And Ray knows a lot about training and a lot about tiger moths. So I'll hand over to Ray. He's all hitched up and ready to roll. And we'll talk to you later.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, well, I'll do the boring bit first and tell you a bit about myself. I've been flying for 68 years this year, and I've had the good fortune to have people pay me to do it for 56 of those years. And in my career, I spent 53 years involved with commercial aviation, airline flying, did 29 years of domestic flying, 10 years of international flying, 6 years as a CASA inspector, and then a few years as an independent consultant and instructor to some small airlines. In 1959, I got my first instructor rating, and throughout my career, I've instructed in both GA. I've kept both ratings, and I've instructed in GA and airline. So obviously, I have a long interest in aviation or in pilot training and pilot education. So in thinking about tonight, I started off thinking of all those things over the years that pilots have had to be educated for. In fact, I feel a little bit miffed at times because I've got, in my children and grandchildren, they've all got degrees and things like that, and I think they haven't got a darn thing to show for it. And yet I think we did a lot of study over the years. If you added all of the time together that we did courses. And so I made a list out of all the things that I could think of that have involved training and education, and then looked at that list and thought, well, I can't talk about them all. I would be easily able to talk about any one of them at length because I've been involved in so many. But I decided to pick out three that I think contributed very significantly to aviation safety. And the three that I picked out was the setting up of a primary training syllabus. Secondly, the introduction of flight training devices. And thirdly, to talk about the introduction by operators of standard operating procedures. As we all know, people started flying in 1903. And over the first probably 12 or 14 years, there were plenty of people that could fly. But that meant that they could take off, go around and land. They didn't really know much about what was happening in between. And of course, with the First World War and the war in Western Europe, there became a demand for a lot of pilots and pilots to be properly trained. And there was one man here, Richard Smith Barry, and he was a squadron commander in France, and he realised that they needed to get properly trained pilots because they're getting so many of these young people coming out from school, more or less, coming straight into the Royal Flying Corps. They had a very high accident rate, and of course, the air war was hotting up. There was starting to be air-to-air combat, and they just couldn't manage the aircraft because they didn't have enough knowledge of aircraft performance and the limitations. So he said, we need to do proper training. And he was able to convince the, I'm not too sure what the man's rank was, the senior man of the Royal Flying Corps, Lord Tedder. And Tedder said, okay, well, we'll put your money where your mouth is. We'll set you up to train pilots. So they set up a place at Gosport in England and set Smithberry in charge of it. So Smithberry, and one of the things that Tedder said to him was, you have to realise that when you turn a pilot out from this training organisation, he is going to go to war. So we need to have him completely trained. And so that was a bit of a challenge, which we'll come back to. So then Smithberry had the job of how do I set this up? So he started to think, what do I need? And the first thing he decided was that he needed an appropriate aeroplane, because he felt that when pilots came to out in a military aircraft, they were flying in a cockpit by themselves. So they really needed to learn to fly in a cockpit where they were by themselves. But if that was the case, then where does the instructor sit? So you needed an aeroplane with 2 seats, 2 cockpits. So he needed a tandem aircraft. And he looked around, and one of the aircraft that was available at the time was the Avro 504. Thanks, Peter. I haven't been able to find a good picture of the Avro 504, but you can vaguely see there are 2 cockpit positions. And next slide, please, Peter. There is Smithberry sitting in the back of one. And so having decided on that as a primary trainer and having 2 seats in it, he then said, well, the next trick is, how does the instructor talk to the student? He can't very well shout at him over the noise of the engine. So they, realising that sound is a pressure wave, they came up with an idea where they said we could put a helmet on the pilot with some sort of cannon in the ears and connect it with a hollow tube and talk through that. And so they became known as Gosport tubes. And this is, you know, with the fine engineering that would have existed in those days, they came up with these 2 slides will show you the Gosport tubes. That was the tube. And now I've never seen any as good as that. But they were incredibly successful, and so much so that when I trained on Tiger Moths in 1956 and 7, we used Gosport tubes. And in fact, as an instructor, I was still using Gosport tubes in Tiger Moths in 1960. Now, I brought along a bit of a jerry-rigged one here. So if any of you want to try it, I'll hand this out and hand this around. I'm going to have to forward a bit. Sorry, Peter, maybe can you just plug that in, that end back into there, please?
You'll be a good guinea pig.
Camera's pointing in the
Right.
right direction.
No, this goes into, there we
There
go. We've got a failure here because that should be plugged into this and it's come out. You any chance of fixing that? If that was heated. I'm sorry, I'll leave that with you, and if we can get it working, you can play with it. Of course, if you really wanted to annoy your instructor and you smoked, you could blow some smoke down there, it'll come out his ears.
When I was a kid, I used jam tins and string.
That's right, yeah.
Matchsticks.
Can we just go to the next slide and we'll show you that. That's what the helmet I'm handing around now. So I was just started to talk about this instructor that Smithberry, or a man that Smithberry knew in Europe, who'd been badly wounded by being shot through both lungs and repatriated back to England. So Smithberry grabbed him as an instructor because he had a lot of faith in him. That man was an Australian, was Norman Brearley. Now, and Sir Norman if I can divert off track a little moment here, I'd just like to tell you a little side story about Sir Norman, which is something you may or may not know about that happens in Australian history. In 1985, I was writing articles for the Australian Federation of Air Pilots, and I was sent to Perth to interview Sir Norman. And I think we've got his picture here. There we are. And that was 4 years before he died. He was nearly 99 when he died. But he was, as you can see, he was standing up, he was articulate, his memory was good. He was great. And he was the man who started the first airline in Australia. And he told me that one of his pilots was Kingsford Smith. So anyway, we were talking away, and all of a sudden, as if it just suddenly occurred to him, he said, "You're from the Pilots Union, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you know that I had the first pilot strike in Australia?" And he said, "And Smithy led it." And I said, "Oh, what was the outcome?" He said, "I sacked the bastard." Anyway, he didn't have a bad view of Smithy at all, because you'll all be familiar with the Casino Royal incident, or Coffee Royal incident. And anyway, sorry, thank you, Coffee Royal incident. And Sir Norman was involved in the search for that. He said there was no way that Smithy would have rigged that. No. Anyway, going back to Smith Barry's flying school, so the instructors got together, and he said, "Now we've got to come up with a syllabus for flying training, which is logical. And we don't want pilots being given a quick briefing, solo flight, and then said they're pilots. We need to go on doing dual with them and do dual mixed in with solo to keep them progressing along." So they started writing up a sequence for flying training, and then they all set about writing notes to support that. And eventually those notes were put together in a little book. Yep. Now, this is not the exact book. The original book looked just exactly like that. That's just like this. And it was called AP 1732A. Now, that book became the little instructor's manual for flying training. And I can remember even in the 50s in Australia, you could buy that book, still called an AP 1732A, and all the aero clubs still used it as their primary source. Now, that was the sequence of training in it, and they were so widely used in the Australian scene that oftentimes when we were filling in our logbook, you would write the number in rather than what you were actually doing. So instead of saying stalling, you just put 9 in your logbook. So that book became almost a Bible in aviation, and it lasted right throughout the Second World War. And it wasn't until the early 60s, I'll just digress. CASA did eventually, or the Department of Transport in Australia eventually reprinted the book. All they did was change the name on the cover. But in 1960, they decided to upgrade it. And so they came out with this one. Next slide. And what I want to show you particularly here is the next slide, which compares the two syllabuses from 40 years apart. Look how similar they are. So Smith Barry and his gang got it right. I guess what we could say now, they're still more or less using this sequence, but what's happened now is that the Australian Civil Aviation Authority, they've developed what they call competency standards. Do you all know what that means when they say something, when we talk about competency standards?
You're well enough.
Well, I don't know, as an example I would use is if you were running a tea shop and you had to employ somebody to make a cup of tea, and you could say, "Well, can you make a cup of tea?" And he says, "Yes." But if you wanted to be really thorough about it because you had discerning customers, you'd have a list and you'd say, "Well, does he use leaves or does he use bags? Does he heat the pot? Does he use reboiled water?" And when you could go through and tick all those things, you could say, now we've got all the competency standards to say. So the competency standards in Australia, or that CASA drew, they took each sequence and boiled it down. Now, what this did is produce a lot of paperwork, because they've now put that into a manual of standards, which is many hundreds of pages long. And it's supported by an instructor's manual, or sorry, an examiner's manual, which is also many hundreds of pages long. So now it's caused a huge increase in paperwork and a lot of complication in the way in which students are presented for testing. One thing, just backtracking a little bit to Smith-Barry and the fact that Lord Tedder said he had to produce an operational pilot at the end. Because of that, he had to have two other aircraft types. Now, I don't know which ones they were, but the second aircraft was an advance on the Avro 504 basic trainer, and then the last aircraft was the type that he would go to war in. That type of thinking has gone on existing in military training in particular. And if we think about the Second World War, where many thousands of pilots were trained, especially a lot here, where they started off in, say, Tiger Moth. Then they took what the transferable skills they learned in the Tiger Moth into a Wirraway. And then the Wirraway, at the end of that, they got their wings. And at the end of that time, when an Air Force pilot got his wings, and I think this still exists today, the thinking is he is now an Air Force pilot. He's qualified to fly anything we put in front of him, provided he goes and does an operational course. And that type of training is able to be done in the Air Force because they can support it with a sophisticated aircraft and equipment to do it. But so I think that's a little bit about Smith-Barry and the fact that he created a flying training sequence which is still around. Now, moving on to that second topic, and this was flight training devices. Now, if we do the next slide, please. When we started doing instrument flying, we would learn basic instrument flying in an airplane like a Tiger Moth, and using just basic flight instruments, such as an airspeed indicator, engine RPM, altimeter, and a turn and balance indicator. And the turn and balance indicator is actually the bottom half is just indicating whether the aircraft's yawing left or right, and the top is whether the rudder is balanced. Now, we all learned to fly basic instrument flying using those type of instruments. And it's amazing how much you could do. You could fly the airplane straight and level. You could fly it on a desired heading because you also had the compass, of course. And the instructor, one of the most important things that the instructor would teach you is how to recover from unusual attitudes. So he'd put the aircraft into extreme positions. He'd say, if you close your eyes, because you had a hood or something over you so you couldn't see outside. He would then say, I'll take over. He'd put the airplane into a couple of turns to disorientate you, put a bit of G on your body, and then he'd hand over the airplane to you in an extreme attitude. It might have a very high nose attitude or a very low nose attitude and a very high angle of bank. And you'd be surprised at how quickly, just using the right sequence we learned, you could get the airplane back under control, even to the extent where we did full spins and spin recoveries on basic panels. And so that's one thing. That's all very well. That's learning how to use your instruments to keep the shiny side of the airplane up, but it's not much use to you because instrument flying is only good if you can go from A to B. And once you get to B, if you're still in cloud, that you can get down out of it. So the next move was they come up with these little devices. This is the link trainer. And this was the device which was invented in the late 30s, and it was still in use. I did my basic conversion from basic instrument flying to airline flying in a link trainer in 1960. So they're still around. And the idea of the link trainer was that it did have a communication system. The instructor would sit at a table out there, and he had an electric headset, and he would close this door all up, that door and this thing, so you were completely inside. And he would then teach you how to fly on instruments using navigation. The primary navigation aids were the radio compass. And the radio compass was just a simple needle that pointed to the station, either pointed to the station or directly away from the one it was tuned to, because the aerial system, it didn't know which side was on. And so the first thing you did was resolve which way that was, and then you had to, the instructor would say to you, well, I want you to fly into a station on a certain heading and a certain bearing. But what we'd look at the radio compass needle, and it was superimposed onto an instrument in the cockpit, which was a 360-degree dial, like a compass rose. But that didn't move, that was just locked, fixed. So what the radio compass was showing you was a relative bearing. And so there was a lot of mental arithmetic involved. There was a little knob on the rose, the compass rose, that you could wind it around and align it with the aircraft, which then meant that you were looking at a relative bearing. But it still required a lot of mental arithmetic, because if you were flying into the station, say on a heading of east 090, and he said to you, I want you to track into the station on a heading of 060, well, you'd know that you'd have to get up to the left to intercept that bearing. You'd know that to do that, you'd need to intercept it at an angle. So you'd have to work out, say maybe go to a heading of 030 and head for that and watch the needle to go around to 30 degrees. All the while he's telling you to change altitude or things like that. So it was very good introduction to basic radio navigation. The other radio aid that was available at the time in Australia was called the VAR, the Visual Aural Range. It was a system that had 4 legs. And these legs, 2 of them were visual legs, and they would put a needle on an indicator in the cockpit, which would either show you blue or yellow, depending on which side of the leg you were on. And those legs could be aligned to track for a particular track, say for instance from Essendon to Albury. And so you could use that needle to fly along a track. The other 2 legs of the visual aural range were aural ones. And what happens if you flew on one side of those, you've got a Morse code N, which is dar dit, or if you went to the other side, you've got a Morse code A, which is dit dar. If you're on track, you didn't get one at all. This was a pretty good introduction to radio navigation instrument flying. Now, I'll start to move on to the beginning of simulators. Now, I must say that simulators are something that we could talk about forever. But what I'll do, I'll just say for a start, before we start looking at the history of simulators, what is the real advantage of flight simulators? What do they cost? Cost is one thing, but by far not the most. The safety is very big. Yep. And the other thing is to be able to make a failure look like it really is. For instance, if you're driving home in your car at night and you get a generator light on, okay, you can just go on driving. It's not a problem to have a generator failure, is it? But what happens now, you've got your electrical system hanging on your battery. So if you go for too long, your lights are going to fail. So in an aeroplane, you can simulate an engine failure easily by closing a throttle, but all of the other stuff still works. Now in the simulator, the beauty of it is it can produce all of the downstream failures. So you can see a failure that as it really looks like in the real aeroplane. The first thing about the simulators was that they started off with a very simple thing like a chair and maybe a diagram of the cockpit where you could start to learn your cockpit familiarisation. The next move along, going through this very quickly, this happened over years, is that they got cockpit procedures trainers where you could get good diagrams of the cockpit, put them on the wall and sit there and you could actually practice your drills and procedures and get used to where things were. And in fact, they still do that. This is an example of a modern one. It's 7371. So when people are doing a conversion, they often stick these things on the wall at home and sit there and practice. So from cockpit procedures trainer, the only thing that was bad about a basic cockpit procedures trainer was that the switches, you could work the switch, but nothing else happened. So to make it more realistic, you had to have it had lights and things that worked as they would in the aeroplane. So as manufacturers got hold of better cockpits, they got complete cockpits, and they actually set them up so that they would work and you could actually go in there and practice your drills and procedures. And of course, the next move then was to make it as much as possible like the real aeroplane so that you could actually fly it. Now, then that's when the complications really start, because then you move into motion, and you can see they put these things on big, long hydraulic legs, and they move. Now, the motion system is it's an interesting subject because you wonder how much people really rely on that sensation. And in fact, there are some schools of thought that says how important is motion. And in fact, I think at some stage they've actually done an experiment with a crew where they actually, during their session, quietly detuned the motion till it wasn't happening. And by the end of the session, they didn't realise the motion was off. So what that's telling you is that your primary senses are your eyes, and that's what you're looking at the instruments with. I think the consensus in the industry now is that realism is best achieved with a bit of motion. The other thing that's tricky about simulators is that, and when I say tricky, I mean, I just can't believe how complicated and how good the people are that figure this all out. But the instruments don't work in the same way. If you've got an airspeed indicator and an altimeter, in an aeroplane, they rely on pitot and static pressure, pitot and changes in static pressure. Well, you don't get pitot pressure in a simulator or changes in static pressure. So the instrument might look like an altimeter, might look like an airspeed indicator, but it's got to work differently. And someone's got to make that happen. And that's pretty tricky. The other interesting thing about simulators, of course, is that we're now in this great machine that just looks like a real airplane until someone says, well, there's one big difference. That is, I can't see out the window. Then they had to start looking at visual systems. And right now, this is a diagrammatic thing. The very early visual systems, they were so rudimentary, they actually put a picture on a wall like that and put a camera on it and projected that image in front of the aircraft. You can go to the next one, Peter. And that, so you can see that's just a made up map. There's the camera. And so they could do approaches and actually see something. But of course, that was pretty rudimentary. And so as time's gone on, they said, well, we need to do better than that. And so someone said, well, why do we need all that greenery and that? As long as we can see the runway lights and the runway centre line, that's all we need. So we can do that with lights. So then we moved into light systems where that's what you mainly had, was just your approach lighting, runway lighting, centre line lighting. And then, of course, if any of you have got kids with computers, you know just how advanced visual systems have got. So it then I got to the stage where with superimposing something like Google Earth, you could actually see an actual scene. And in fact, I did a bucket list thing a little while ago and had a very brief fly in a Concorde simulator. And one of the things they said to us, well, you can do one circuit and one landing. Where do you want to do it? You can do it at Sydney, Hong Kong's old approach, or London. And so I chose London. Bang, there's East London, the Thames River, Millennium Dome. Perfect. And so that's a really huge move. But the simulated visual systems are so complicated. I looked at a paper written by a NASA engineer on visual systems. It was 80 pages long, and it was just streams of mathematics. I took one look at it and got the papers, and it's very, very complex. And so say simulators. Well, how do airlines use simulators? Normally, what happens is they'll each pilot will do about 4 sessions in a simulator a year. And normally they do it with a partner. So you do a 4-hour session. You do 2 hours yourself and then change seats and you support the other guy. Normally what will happen is that they'll allow 2 sessions back to back, which are training sessions, to let you get familiar with the simulator again. Because if you've only fly it once every 6 months, you need a bit of settling in. Then the other 2 sessions, one will be used as a check session for the airline, and the other one, if the simulator is an approved simulator by CASA, it can be used to actually do instrument rating renewals. So they will renew your instrument rating in the simulator. But to get that approval from CASA for the simulator has to be exactly right. Exactly, to the point of even the little placards on the wall, they must be exactly the same as the real aeroplane. The other thing that the CASA allow airlines to do is that they say, well, rather than having to do all your instrument rating renewal in one session, we can allow you to spread it over. So they have you can do a bit this time and a bit next time, but they have an approved program. And they do the same with training, because they say, if we have a cyclical program based over, say, 3 years, we should be able to cover just about every emergency or abnormality in the aeroplane. So each time we'll just move to another one. And so most airlines use them now with cyclical programs. It's hard to say, isn't it, cyclical? Anyway, and the other thing, of course, that is now very common is 0 flight time conversions for pilots. My last airline conversion was a 747-400. The first time I flew it, the real airplane, I had 440 passengers on that. And so the simulators are so good now, you can do your entire conversion in the simulator and just go out with a training captain in the other seat and fly the real airplane. So the simulators are an amazing piece of equipment, and they provide all that economy and safety and that we've talked about, but there's a downside, and that is the simulators that must be used by a good instructor. Nothing can make a bad instructor can destroy you in the simulator. And what's a bad instructor? Well, sometimes to get maximum utilisation of the simulators, the airlines will run them 24 hours a day. So if you happen to get a 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. session, it means you've been out there at 2 o'clock in the morning for a briefing, and it's back of the clock, and then you go and you do a 4-hour session, which is pretty tiring. Now, if the instructor then decides he wants to do an hour and a half debrief at 8 o'clock in the morning, not on. You don't want to know, and you won't take it notice. So a good instructor will manage that he'll pick just a few important points, because what he realises is just about everybody gets out of the simulator pretty self-critical. They know what they did wrong, they know what they can do better. So he should minimise that post-flight briefing. Also, in the simulator himself, he could use it to overload you, because you can put in multiple failures. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard about the Russian, I don't know what he is, psychologist, Pavlov. He experimented with dogs. And what he could do, he could teach his dogs to respond to a certain stimulus. He did something, or the dog would go to that corner to get its biscuit, or that corner to get its biscuit. And what he found was that if he put in multiple stimulus, the dog not only would get it wrong, they couldn't remember anything. And he coined a term for that. He called it protective inhibition. And he said humans are like that too. There'll come a point where you can overload a human to the point where they just can't think. And I think I've seen that in simulators. I've actually almost experienced it myself. I was once doing some experimenting where I was being used by a group who were experimenting with different altimeter presentations. And they had us flying it was actually a mini trainer. And they'd give us a complicated series of exercises, and then suddenly say, read the altimeter. And if they made it hard enough, you get to the stage, you look at the altimeter and you think, I can't think what the damn thing's saying. And so they've had that experience where you can be overloaded. point being that a good instructor in the simulator, and the airlines are very careful about how they do train instructors, that you don't overload the student. So by giving him multiple failures. And because he's going to have enough failures anyhow, because the simulator will reproduce the real failure where you'll have the downstream failures anyhow. So that was simulators. And the last thing I wanted to mention was standard operating procedures. Standard operating procedures might sound a bit like trained monkeys. Everybody's going to do the same thing the same way every time. It's not quite like that. Mainly each airline will have its own standard operating procedures, which ensure that everybody in that airline does everything the same way. But the SOPs, as they call them, may not be the same from company to company. And in fact, when I changed airlines and went to the international airline, there were 13 of us on the course. It's just another little side story. And the company said, "We know you've all been employed here as experienced pilots, and so you all will have come from companies where you are totally familiar with standard operating procedures. We want you to use ours. Don't bring yours. We don't want any wildcards. Don't bring in your procedure. If you think your procedure is better than ours, use ours and go and convince the chief pilot why yours is a better one. And if it's a better one and you can convince him, then maybe he'll have us all do it." But it is really important. And in a long-range international airline, you can often not meet people you'll be working with them for 10 years and never have met them. And I can remember one particular flight on a 747 Classic where my flight engineer was a Pakistani. And he was Pakistani, so his name was Mohammed. And the first officer was a Mexican, and they used Jesus. So I thought, well, I wonder if the passengers know that they're up there with a peasant and Jesus and Mohammed. They wouldn't be too worried, would they? But the good thing about it was we were able to work together completely. It flew the airplane without a problem because we were all totally involved in standard operating procedures. And another little funny story, if I can tell you one, was when they were giving this lecture at the airline, they said, "We allow in this country people to have 3 or 4 days off for a religious ceremony that they need to go to." And they said, "Any starters?" And one of the Melbourne blokes put up his hand and said, "Yes, last week in September." And they said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Oh, VFL final." Now, what I was going to more or less finish up on here is show you standard operating procedures where they haven't worked. And if we can just go ahead now. Well, that's, before we go off, that's a complete 727 simulator cockpit. And I'll digress a little bit here. This was an interesting thing in terms of aircraft technology. This is a DC-9 cockpit. And one of the very interesting things on the DC-9 was this panel here. See it there? Now that had about 90 odd lights on it. And it had every advisory light, warning light, everything. And so when you got in the aeroplane, first started up, there'd be all these lights there. But as you got things started and they came online, the light would go out. And eventually when you got to the end of the runway, the other thing that the aeroplane has is a takeoff warning device. So if you go to open the throttles and you haven't got the flaps in the right position or the trim in the right position, you'll get a takeoff warning horn. So the theory with this sort of cockpit thing was, when you got to the end of the runway and you open the throttles, they'd say, "All quiet, all dark, all right." But the next, to ensure standard operating procedures, the company had every one of these lights had a standard operating procedure associated with it in the operations manual. And that would be what the manuals look like. Next one. And this was a thing that was produced by TAA. And what that's done, that's a copy of that annunciator panel. And under each one, it's got the page reference of the operations manual. So if you're flying along and And this came on. You could look at that page and go straight to it and use the standard operating procedure, which the company would have laid down, was for the emergency actions, the memory actions to be taken by one pilot, to be followed up by the other one, and the checklist read straight away. Okay, so now you could also have standard operating procedures in terms of aircraft performance. So you could say that it was a standard operating procedure that the aircraft must be properly configured for approach to land by, say, 1,500 feet. And on its approach, the standard operating procedure would specify that you must not have a sink rate in excess of, say, 800 feet a minute. You must not have a speed deviation of greater than 15 knots. I'm not saying they're the actual ones, just an example. Now, we all probably know of the 777 accident in San Francisco, where there was just a total disregard for those sort of standard procedures. Excellent. And that's what he left on the end of the runway in San Francisco. That's his airplane. And there was a total disregard of standard operating procedures. This one's an old one where that 707 took off out of London, and it had a full crew plus a check captain on it in the jump seat, and took off, got an engine fire, and the captain decided the best thing to do is get this airplane back out of the air as quickly as possible. So he did a quick circuit and landed, but no one had ever pulled the fire handle. Oh. Because there was just disregard for standard operating procedures. And the last one now, which is tragic, you all remember the Concorde crash. Now the Concorde there, what you can see there is the Concorde is on fire. Yeah, the fire was there. Now that was underneath the engine, and that fire was causing the engine fire wanting to go. But the engine was still running. And that's very important, because what happened was that the flight engineer bent over without totally disregard the standard and shut the engine down. And that's what caused the next, the airplane, it just couldn't, it could have flown away like that. It didn't. It crashed because it just didn't have enough power to keep going. There were other factors involved in that accident. The aircraft was overloaded, it was running downwind, lots of things wrong. Anyway, I think that's sort of got too close to the end of what I had planned to talk about. If anybody wants to look at these books, they're here.
So, any questions? All right.
Just wondering about that Qantas accident at Singapore, and they had the engine basically exploded and took out a whole lot of systems, and then that had to be sorted out with pretty much a committee in the cockpit.
Yes, you're right. But what I'm a little bit loath to comment too much about it. But what I know is that the general opinion is that the first officer really kept the thing going. He just insisted on reading the checklist. He stuck to standard procedures, read the checklist, and that's how they covered everything. And the first officer, from what I know, I know of one of the check captains who was on the aircraft. He said the first officer carried the day.
Could I just make one observation? Has anyone here flown the Link trainer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Self-taught after school.
Well, in 1967, when I was on my pilot's course, I was flying Link trainers, and everyone in the Air Force who was a pilot was flying Link trainers. And as my anecdote said, I failed Link trainers, but luckily I could fly the aircraft.
I'm sorry.
They were mongrel things to fly.
You said you had a Link trainer then, what?
1967.
Yeah.
That's what all Air Force pilots were trained on in the late 60s. And I don't know when they came out, probably 45, was it?
Yeah, well, TAA used them, as I said, to transition from, because when we joined the airlines, we had nothing, basic commercial licenses. We were GA instructors. And so we did DC3 conversion, twin engine conversion, instrument rating, and the instrument rating conversion was done in the Link.
So here's a leading question. You have such vast experience and flown for long. How many bad instructors, because I don't like instructors much, how many bad instructors to good instructors did you strike during your lifetime? Percentage wise.
Yeah. I I'd have a bit of trouble putting a number on it. What I would say is more a more general answer to that, and that is that in the airlines, once you were in the training department, you tended to stay in it. And so sometimes you would get one person as an instructor who was often training people who weren't passing. And no one would bite the bullet and say, you're the problem. And I do remember in the A300 and TAA, we had a good flight manager, and he eventually said to one of the training captains, the training captain was a very good man on cars. And he said, if I ever want information on a car, I'll come to you, but not about how to fly an A300.
Just before I hand this over to Warwick, I had an experience with a bad instructor here, learning to fly from Royal Queensland right out of this room, actually, around the corner here, flying Victor Air Tourers. And I'm only a little bloke, and not a lot of weight, and I was only about 17 or 18 at the time, 17 I think I was. And I was doing spin training, and as you know, Victor will spin quite well, gets quite developed. And I was standing on the rudder, hanging on to everything I possibly could, using that to, add the extra weight into it. And he was most unimpressed with it. And he whacked me so hard on the arm that he broke my wristwatch.
Oh, yeah.
He broke the thing. That was the last time I flew with that instructor.
Years ago, one of the many other subjects in training was when they introduced cockpit resource management.
Yeah.
And one of the beauties of the early cockpit resource management training was it introduced us to a language of how to describe cockpit styles. And so they would have a graph with one argument was 1 to 9. That was on competence, and the other one was 1 to 9 on ability to get on with people. So a 9-1 captain was incredibly competent, but terrible fellow to deal with. And whenever we had one captain in TAA who was always used as an example of a 9-1 captain. Well, I won't name him because he's... But he was a strange fellow. I can remember doing when I was a young first officer. I did 9 sectors with him one day and over 2 days in the DC3, and he abused me the whole way. And I remember going on the last leg into lay in the beginning and thinking, this is airline flying, they can have it. I don't want it. And lo and behold, in the last leg, he put his arm around me and said, you're doing all right, son.
Good thing he said that to you. You also linked trainers at TAA. Didn't fly in one until I was already on Fokker Friendships. And all the TAA flight proper simulators were in Melbourne. And we'd go down there. Sometimes they had basically mock up a bit like a Constellation, I think, but ex-Constellation.
It wasn't all Constellation.
Yeah, but that was just doing basic stuff, not meant to be a total airplane. And the link trainer was just to give you something that they can give you a part of your license renewal in basic instrument flying under the hood and that sort of thing.
It's funny with the simulators, as I said, they gave us the choice of flying at one of 3 places. One of the things that everybody does in a simulator when they've got someone who's not used to simulator is they'll say, look, there's the Sydney Harbour Bridge, see if you can fly under it. And even on this thing, when we got airborne, he said to my friend, he said, do you want to fly under the Tower Bridge? Or fly through the Tower Bridge? And he did, but we rode off Parliament House.
Talking about flying under the Harbour Bridge, I've had a couple of sessions in Virgin's 737 MAX simulator at Brisbane Airport. And the last one was just a few weeks ago, and we were just mucking around and we did a circuit from Sydney, took off from Sydney, flew under the Harbour Bridge around the Opera House and landed back on the runway. And I've got it all on video, so if anyone would like to see it, I'll show it later. Oh, and by the way, Virgin have got an 737 NG simulator for sale. They're getting rid of that and putting in a new Max simulator. So if anyone's got a spare $40 million, you can buy one and stick it in your garage.
Actually, if anyone wants to have a go at one, Queensland Aviation Museum at Caloundra, they've got a 737 sim set up there with an approved instructor, and he can go up and you can have a serious fly of it. But that Concorde exercise was interesting because I didn't want to fly under the Tower Bridge. I wanted to have a go at landing the Concorde, and actually I'd been given some notes on what was peculiar about the approach of the Concorde, and it was amazing how even just that one landing you could see that the simulator did exactly what they said it would do.
Anybody for anything else?
Yeah, I had one more little war story I wanted to tell you, but I was a bit reluctant because I hoped it wouldn't offend anybody. But one of the things about standard operating procedures is that they are terrific. They're good, but you get sick of them. And one of the things that, as a domestic pilot, you could do 4 or 5 sectors in a day. The longest checklist was the pre-start checklist. And you get to the stage where you've read it 5 times a day and you think, oh, if I've got to read that again, I'll throw it out the window. And anyway, years ago, my wife and I came down from Singapore where we were based. And here in Brisbane, they had the musical Les Mis on. And we wanted to go and see it. And they rang up and they said, look, we're all sold out, but we're putting an extra row of seats in right at the front. If you're happy to sit there, you can have seats. So we got seats and we're sitting down with our knees up against the edge of the orchestra pit. So the orchestra all come in, they're all tuning their instruments and mucking around. And the bloke in front of us had a keyboard. And anyway, suddenly the conductor comes in, he picks up his baton and they all sit up straight. The bloke with the keyboard opens his music up and it's got written right across the top in big letters, here we go again. And I thought, I know exactly how you feel.
Well, thanks, Ray. I think that was great. I hope everybody enjoyed it.